I said, whoever she is, I'm going to go with it. I'm going to take a chance. And we did, and she was wonderful.
Hollywood has witnessed countless broken marriages, but few expected that Robert Redford, the man who seemed flawless on screen, would fail to hold together his own home. The divorce between him and his wife of 27 years, Lola Van Wagenen, unfolded quietly but carried the weight of a shockwave. Only one mysterious event appeared to trigger the sudden unraveling. But was that truly the only reason? Or were there deeper shadows, untold tragedies that had slowly worn down the marriage from within? Let's trace the key turning points. In 1957, Robert Redford was a 20-year-old young man lost in turmoil. Following the sudden death of his mother, who had been a profound influence on his life, Redford spiraled into confusion. He dropped out of college, wandered across Europe, and drank so heavily that he was expelled from an art school in Paris. Returning to the U.S., as a man torn between the soul of an artist and the aimlessness of youth, Redford moved to Los Angeles to attend the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Though he still wasn't sure what he truly wanted, it was in that city, inside a modest apartment complex, that he met Lola Van Wagenen, the young woman who would alter the course of his life in ways he would later admit he never expected. Lola was just 17 at the time, a devout Mormon born in Provo, Utah, into a deeply religious, education-focused family. In stark contrast to Redford's restless and rebellious nature, Lola was the embodiment of calm, principle, and discretion. These qualities made her stand out and irresistibly appealing to Redford, a man in desperate need of something or someone to anchor him. In one of his rare interviews about their relationship, Redford once said, "I married her because I needed to be saved. And at that time, she really did save me." Their love story moved quickly. Less than a year after meeting, they decided to get married, not with a grand church ceremony or the joyful blessings of two families, but with a spontaneous, impulsive wedding in Las Vegas. Just 5 weeks later, however, under pressure from Lola's family, the couple held a formal Mormon ceremony in Provo, bringing religious and legal validation to their union. They began building a family almost immediately. Redford pursued acting while Lola stepped into the background, raising their children and tending to their home. They had 4 children in total: Scott, born in 1959, Shauna in 1960, Jamie in 1962, and Amy in 1970. Unlike many celebrity couples who embrace the spotlight, Redford and Lola retreated to Utah, the place where they had celebrated their religious vows. There, they established a simple ranch amid breathtaking natural landscapes. For Redford, it was a way to protect his private life from public intrusion. For Lola, it aligned perfectly with her introverted personality and traditional family values. For years, they lived like a typical American family, raising children, gardening, and staying far from flashing cameras and bright stage lights. Even as Redford's fame steadily grew through his early roles, he made a conscious effort to shield his personal life. Lola, who never aspired to be the wife of a celebrity, rarely appeared publicly by his side at major events. From the outside, their marriage seemed admirable, a rising star who chose a quiet life with the woman who stood by him before fame, building a home and raising their children together. But behind the perfect image, subtle differences in background, beliefs, and especially in how each coped with grief, were slowly driving a wedge between them. Unhealed loss. In 1959, just a year after their wedding, Robert Redford and Lola Van Wagenen welcomed their first child, a baby boy named Scott Anthony Redford. But the joy of becoming parents soon turned into an unthinkable tragedy. At just 2 months old, Scott died from sudden infant death syndrome, one of the most mysterious causes of infant mortality at the time, with medical science offering almost no explanation. For a young couple just beginning to build a life together, it wasn't simply a devastating blow. It was a psychological fracture, an invisible wound that wouldn't just linger for months, but would echo through the rest of their lives. Redford, only 22 years old then, didn't know how, or perhaps didn't dare to confront the grief. He avoided it by throwing himself entirely into work. He painted, took more acting classes, and slowly stepped into the entertainment industry. This was how he stayed in control, by turning sorrow into action, refusing to let it sit within the home. Lola, on the other hand, needed to grieve aloud. She didn't want answers about why their child had died. She just needed someone to cry with, to hold her without pretending to be strong. But what she received instead was a husband who grew quieter, colder with each passing day. This became a subtle but damaging turning point in their relationship. After Scott's death, they could no longer reach one another emotionally. Everything remained quiet but undeniably present. They had more children, lived under the same roof, attended events together, sat side by side in church, but some things were never spoken of again. In an interview years later, Redford stated candidly, "I don't like sharing my emotions. I deal with pain alone." To an outsider, those words might sound like strength, but to someone who shared his home, it was a declaration that every door to intimacy had been shut. And in doing so, one of the most essential elements that sustains a marriage, the ability to empathize through grief, had vanished quietly, almost from the beginning of their life together. This was not the kind of rift that makes headlines "no infidelity," no public arguments, but it slowly eroded trust and emotional closeness, little by little until love still existed, but there was no space left for it to land. And so, when that quiet grief remained unresolved, life kept moving, pulling Robert Redford into an entirely different world, a world filled with stage lights, applause, and fame rewards on the surface, but in truth, a towering shadow that overwhelmed everything that once belonged only to him and his family. The height of fame, from the late 1960s to the early 1980s, Robert Redford rose to become a global icon. With his chiseled features, quiet gaze, and effortless acting style, he wasn't just a box office draw, he became a cultural symbol. Films like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, The Great Gatsby, and All the President's Men tied his name to the image of the ideal American man, brave, reserved, and profoundly introspective. Still, fame, even though he never actively sought it, inevitably pulled Redford away from ordinary life. Every successful role cost him time at home. Every award ceremony took him another step further from his family. He couldn't turn down film offers, nor could he resist political or socially symbolic projects. He was caught in a cycle he once tried to avoid, and for that very reason, he couldn't escape it. In a rare moment of reflection, Redford once admitted that he had wanted a simple life living on a ranch, raising kids, and painting. But once cinema called his name, the chance to live as an ordinary man disappeared. Private values became more unattainable than the Oscar itself. Each time he returned to Utah, a sense of disconnection crept through the rooms of his home. No one blamed him, but no one was waiting anymore. This was no longer just a story about a marriage. It was the inner tragedy of a man slowly losing contact with himself. Redford didn't have affairs. He wasn't part of any scandal. But he was absent in life's most important moments, not physically, but emotionally. And tragically, he, an artist constantly in pursuit of authenticity, could not face the truth within his own family that he had quietly stepped away from the role of husband, not because of someone else, but because he had traded that private part of himself in pursuit of a spotlight the world had placed upon him. And then, a choice that seemed simple to Redford became the turning point that sealed the fate of his marriage, a turning point of destiny. In 1981, at the peak of his fame, Robert Redford made a move that surprised the independent film world. and sparked immense hope. He founded the Sundance Institute, a non-profit organization based in Utah, with a mission to support emerging filmmakers and give them the freedom to experiment, create, and tell their own stories without being bound by the commercial standards of Hollywood. Sundance wasn't just a film initiative. For Redford, it was a personal manifesto, a strong response to the glitz, artificiality, and pressure of the mainstream film industry. It was a space where he could reset the artistic balance, a place with no studio demands, no box office pressures, and no spotlight to outshine the story. But it was also at Sundance that Redford began to drift further away from his family. On the surface, Redford still lived in Utah, the state where he and Lola had built their home from the early days. But once Sundance was born, his daily life shifted to Sundance Mountain Resort, a property he had owned since the 1960s. It quickly became his spiritual headquarters, the place where he spent most of his time working, developing ideas, running creative workshops, and nurturing a new generation of filmmakers. His private life was slowly consumed by the world of art. What made it undeniably clear wasn't his actions, but his words. In a rare interview, when asked about the role of family in Sundance, Redford replied simply, "Sundance is my private space. It doesn't belong to the public, and it doesn't belong to the family." A statement like an invisible line cutting off whatever fragile connection remained between the two worlds he lived in, one as an artist, the other as a husband and father. Lola, with her composed and traditional nature, didn't oppose him publicly. On the contrary, she supported the philosophy Redford pursued and even respected his effort to preserve the purity of cinema. But support did not mean belonging. She began to feel increasingly excluded from the spiritual realm her husband was immersing himself in. Deep conversations became rare. Family dinners became occasional. And then one day, they no longer knew what to say to each other. While Redford poured all his energy into Sundance, Lola began her own journey. She enrolled at Vermont College, later earning a master's degree in public history from New York University in 1984. Not long after, she completed a PhD at Union Institute and University, specializing in American history. She also founded educational initiatives and produced documentary films focusing on civil rights and women's history. From being a quiet, supportive wife, Lola had become a scholar and cultural activist, living in a world entirely separate from her husband. The imbalance was now unmistakable. Redford, the man who once married Lola because she could hold him in place, was now using creative freedom as the very reason to keep moving. And Lola, the woman who once willingly stepped back, was quietly stepping forward, alone. Both were pursuing meaningful endeavors, but there was no longer a shared anchor to hold the marriage in place. There were no arguments, no clear wrongdoings, but the distance had formed. And that lack of confrontation made the fracture even deeper. In later interviews, Redford often avoided discussing his past marriage. When pressed, he only offered, "We went our separate ways." But nothing bad ever happened. That only made many believe they had been separated long before the divorce papers were signed. From a mountain in Utah, once thought to be a promised land for art, Redford unintentionally lost the very person who helped build the foundation of his life. And from that same place, Lola came to understand the space Redford needed to live no longer had room for her. Perhaps that was why they finally did the one thing both had long tried to avoid, saying goodbye, letting go in silence. In 1985, after nearly 3 decades together, Robert Redford and Lola Van Wagenen officially finalized their divorce. No press conference, no legal battle, no courtroom drama, no public statement was ever released. Everything ended in silence. At the time, the media, always eager to follow Redford because of his fame, remained completely unaware. The couple had always been extremely private, so much so that it wasn't until years later, when a reporter discovered they were living in separate places, that the story of their divorce came to light. Even then, neither of them offered a formal confirmation. The press learned of it through civil documents and vague responses such as, "We still respect each other." After the divorce, Redford entered a quiet chapter in his romantic life. Though he was considered one of the most desirable men in Hollywood, he rarely made his relationships public. There were rumors that he had brief romances with actress Sonia Braga and makeup artist Kathy O'Rear. But nothing lasted. Redford remained in Utah, kept his private life away from the spotlight, continued making films, skiing, writing, and pouring energy into Sundance Institute, now an iconic institution in world cinema. It wasn't until 1996 that Redford met the final love of his life, Sibylle Sagers, a German painter with a deeply kindred spirit. They lived together for over a decade before marrying in 2009. No lavish wedding, no white dress, just a quiet ceremony at home with a few loved ones present. Like Lola before her, Sibylle respected Redford's need for privacy completely. They lived a discreet life in Utah, free of scandals, untouched by tabloids, and rarely speaking to the press. It was a second act quiet, steady for a man who once carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Redford never spoke publicly about his divorce from Lola, not because he was hiding anything, but perhaps because he understood that the most sacred things aren't meant to be explained. Still, if one pays close attention, his later films, such as A River Runs Through It and The Horse Whisperer, often carry a silent undercurrent of parting between people who still care. In 2018, Redford announced his retirement. When asked why, he simply said, "I want to close the curtain on my story, while I still have a say in it." A few years later, grief returned once again. His second son, Jamie Redford, died in 2020 from liver cancer after years of battling illness. In one of his rare public remarks, Redford said, "My son was a light. Now I'm learning to live without that light." Once again, the father chose to grieve in silence, just as he had done when Scott passed years earlier. But this time, Sibylle was beside him, a partner who understood that not every sorrow needs words to be felt. Lola, too, moved on with her life. She remarried and settled in Vermont, a land of white snow, red maple trees, and peaceful old universities. She continued her work in historical research and educational development. Though no longer husband and wife, Redford and Lola stayed in contact through their children and grandchildren. They appeared together at family events, even posed in photos. No need to avoid each other. No one took sides. There were no winners or losers, just two people who once loved, once walked the same path, and finally understood that love alone isn't enough without a shared rhythm in life. Their story had no loud climax, no dramatic conclusion, but neither did it have the idyllic reconciliation often found in novels. It was simply two people choosing to part ways with dignity, and that, in itself, was rare in a Hollywood landscape accustomed to scandal, betrayal, and post-divorce warfare. Redford once said, "I don't believe in dramatic endings. I believe in silence because it speaks louder than anything else." And perhaps that was the way he chose to say goodbye to a marriage that lasted more than 25 years, a farewell without shouting, but one that still lets those who have ever loved recognize sometimes. Letting go isn't about resentment. It's because the love was real and has run its course. They were once two lost young souls who crossed paths at an unnamed crossroads. Together, they built a home, endured loss, fame, the pressures of public life, and the true cost of success. In the end, they parted not because something went wrong, but because everything that was once right could no longer hold the flame. And if there's one legacy left from that marriage, it's this: a way to walk away without bitterness, without destroying the past, and without denying the love that once was. A kind of maturity not everyone is brave enough to choose. If you value thoughtful stories and little-known truths behind the lives of Hollywood legends, this is the place for you. Hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any video that reveals what fame so often hides. And drop a comment below. What do you think about how they let go? Was it a failure or a different kind of growth?